I thought I would throw in this little tidbit about how to time your engines, being that there isn't a lot of information in the manual on it. Pretty simple. The number one thing is our firing order is 1-3-4-2, which seems a little odd, but that's the way it is. So when you're looking at it, 1-3-4-2. So if the distributor spins clockwise, as does the engine. So your timing belt is going to be spinning in a clockwise motion. You've got your crank, your cam, and your intermediate shaft, which drives the oil pump. So the way it's timed, there's a mark above the center of the crank pulley, and when that's lined up straight through, it goes to the crank. So you're looking at that orientation. When everything is lined up, you're good. And then there's a mark on your crank sprocket. I've replaced mine, but on my trigger wheel, I've got a mark, and also on the crank sprocket. Make sure they're very visible. Put them in white or silver, something you're going to see. And then the way it lines up is that number one timing mark references to the intermediate shaft center. So if they're lined up, everything's in time. And there's a mark on the crank sprocket, or I'm sorry, on the intermediate shaft sprocket and on the crank sprocket. So there's one here for the crank sprocket, one here on the intermediate shaft. And again, you're going to spin in a clockwise motion. So when they're all lined up, intermediate to crank, crank to cam, you're all in tune. You can put your timing belt on, adjust your tensioner, get it snug, and you're good. Now if you can't see these sprockets, if you can get the crank sprocket around to the center of the intermediate shaft, you can also check it here by pulling the distributor. So your number one on the distributor is going to be here, pointing towards number one spark plug, or very close to it. So that's how to know where that's referenced properly. So when you pull the distributor and look down at the oil pump, you can see there's two lines in there. And when they're aligned side to side, that means that you're either on center or 180 degrees off. So that would be either here or with the line 180 degrees off. But if it's 180 off, you should be able to see that notch in the sprocket to know that you're out of phase. So if you bring it back around, and even if you can't see exactly how close it is, if you can look in here and just turn it until that's lined straight across, you can see that down here. Now another thing to keep in mind, if you ever have to tear your engine down or replace an oil pump, that when you put that pump in, it's not centered perfectly. There's some slop in the bolts, in between the holes in the bolts. So it is possible to get your oil pump a little bit out of center and have it sitting off. And what that's going to do is when your distributor is spinning, these teeth will not be lined up centered in the bore. So your distributor is centered, but this shaft is being forced back and forth. So you're actually putting torque on it. And my son had the experience when he was driving it out to Kansas that I had rebuilt the engine and replaced the oil pump without checking that center. And he actually broke the end off the distributor down into the oil pan. So it killed the car, and he was able to, fortunately, it wasn't too far from an Advance Auto or AutoZone, and they ordered him one overnight, and he had it in the next morning and replaced the distributor, and he was good to go, because this was sitting in the bottom of the oil pan. It was no big deal. So just something to keep in mind, that if that is not centered, it looks wrong, don't put it together and put the distributor in, because you're going to end up breaking the distributor somewhere down the line. I'd never heard of that, but I experienced it. Actually, he experienced it. So when you put it in, again, number 1 is in the direction of number 1. It's kind of between 1 and 2. And the other thing I did was the coil wire. It's kind of a long run, so I put some sheathing on it to protect it. So there's my tips. Now that we're getting closer to actually getting the engine back in, I decided to do a little upgrade. I had down here is an Accusump oil accumulator. If you're not familiar with them, there's a lot of YouTube videos on them to bring you up to speed. I had it for the Daytona, but I'm not close to getting the Daytona running, and I decided that if I ever wanted to put it in this car, now is the time. So even though it's not going to get any hard track day use, I still wanted to have it keep the bearings lubed, even if it sits for a long time, because it is more of a show car. So here's the Accusump. Again, it's a 1-quart accumulator. You keep 10 psi of air pressure in it when it's empty, and then when your engine's running and the valve is open, it'll push this internal piston open, and as the further that piston comes in, letting in up to a quart, the higher your oil pressure is going to be. So you'll get up to 60 psi or whatever your car runs at. And then if you ever starve your starve your oil pickup, and you don't have oil coming out of the pump, when this valve is opened on here, it's sitting as an accumulator, so it will shove that oil back in under this air pressure into the engine for a second or two, whatever it needs to get that oil back into the pickup, and then resume oiling your engine normally. So nothing. I had the brackets down here for the intercooler, and I decided that since I already had them, I just put another bracket on and mount the oil accumulator to that. The center one's more for just retaining it, doesn't really have any stress, because you're only supposed to stress the outer edges. So this is what it looks like. Sits out of the way. Again, the lasers have these nice big front ends that you can stuff things in, so you got all your intercooler piping, your intercooler, and the accumulator. Got the engine compartment pretty much done. Just have to tighten a few more bolts, make sure everything's torqued. And hopefully by the end of the day I'll have a motor in here. Well, it's finally time to put the engine back in. It's been out since 2018. Hard to believe it's been that long. Before I threw it in, I wanted to see if everything would fit, and it looks like I've got to take the alternator and the compressor off to have enough clearance to get it through the front. That's only about a 10-minute job to put that back together. I can leave the power steering pump by the looks of it. It doesn't stick out much further than everything else. And if you've never put an engine into one of these, I always have gone in from the top. I don't have the height to go in from the bottom. If I had a lift, that'd be great. I'd put it in from the bottom. But if you've never done it and you're using a cherry picker, I would strongly suggest getting one of these adjustable balance beams. I think that's what they call them. I actually end up having the engine cocked at about that much of an angle when I drop it down in there to clear both sides, because it won't go in the way it is now. It's too wide. I'm not going to bother showing how it's put in, because filming it would be a pain. But she's ready to go back. I did put the cable on first, as I said before, because I had the bellows on it, and If I have to, I can pull that off. It's only 3 bolts and the shaft, but I think I can get it in there. There's enough clearance over here. So we'll see how it goes. I know this is going to be controversial. I'm sure I've read it before, but I want to bring up the correct orientation of this motor mount. And if you look at the manual, it shows it to be the other way. But looking at the engine, I've got a weird level. It's got 5 lines on it. But if you look at the orientation of the bubble, we're just about touching the 2nd line from the right. And if I put that on this engine, and we look at the bubble again, it's 2 lines from the right. Well, if I swap this motor mount around to be the correct orientation, like the factory wants us to have, it puts the pivot point below the bolt, the center line. So that raises up the engine 3/8 of an inch from side to side, probably closer to a half by the time you get over to here. So in my mind, this is the correct orientation because it puts the engine at square to the car instead of being up in the air. So I know a lot of people are going to disagree, including the factory, but I would rather have my engine parallel to the car than have it offset. So let me know what you think. I have the engine in. Hydraulic clutch, plumbing worked well. I was able to route the line through the frame with a grommet around it. So that goes back to the hydraulic master. The serpentine belt setup is going to be nice. Good clearance. And the nice thing is there's good space here between this brake line and the belt, so I don't have to worry about that. I did run some wires up through the frame, keep them out of the way. Power steering, hydraulic line went in nice, good clearance there. So clearance wise, I'm happy with things. One thing I did do also is on my fuel injection, I've had a problem with the fuel pump bleeding backwards. So when you shut the key off, you lose all your fuel pressure. And I have not been able to troubleshoot it, so I decided what I would do was put in a one-way check valve on the fuel rail. So now fuel will come into the rail and then over to the regulator through this line, and it won't be able to return back. So the regulator will lock the pressure and this check valve will lock it. So that hopefully will be taken care of. So again, clearance wise, everything looks good. I was looking for a nice power steering fluid reservoir, and this one came out of around 2000 Dodge Caravan, and I like the design. I was going to use it for the car. It's got a mounting bracket here that I could make something else to adapt it to. You got your out and your in. I was going to put that in over here, but as you can see, it sits a little high, so I'd have to mount it more down into this area to get it there, and I just didn't want it. I wanted to keep it up as high as I could get it, and what I came up with was from the mid-90s Toyota Camrys had this type of a reservoir, and as you can see, it's much more compact. And it comes with this nice bracket, so to me this is the way to go. So now what I've got to do is adapt the hydraulic hose, which it's all low pressure, but I need to get a hose from here to the pump, and I want to use AN fittings on both ends. So that's what I'm trying to work out, is how to adapt it to change the clamp style hose to an AN threaded. So here's my plan. I cut the output tube till it's 3/8 of an inch from the end of this flange. And I want to thread in a straight fitting. This is a 10 AN fitting without the hose adapter on it. And this is a very fine thread. But what I did was I took a 1/4 inch MPT tap and I drilled this out to a 1/2 inch ID. Took a 1/2 inch drill and drilled it. And I know it's going to split, so I took a piece of hose. This is 5/8 inch heater hose, and I cut it just a little bit longer, put it over the end, tapped this for 1/4 MPT, took the tap as far down as it would go, and that allows me enough of a hole with some threads that I can thread this in. Now what I haven't decided is if I'm going to keep this on there, but I think I'm going to, because that'll give it some rigidity. Otherwise it'll just split this tubing wall, the poly wall. And then I can, if I have to, I can put a hose clamp around it, but that should take care of the leak. Once you get that in there, especially if you clamp it, I don't see that ever leaking. I could possibly put some thread sealant on it too, as well, since I'm putting it in there. Put some Teflon paste on it. So that's my plan. That'll give me a female output, and I just have to put an adapter on it. I can go male to male. And then my braided hose will just screw up the end of that. I've got the power steering supply hose plumbed in, and I use this 10 AN hose. This is the rubber hose internally. I haven't used the rubber hose in a long time, but I had a bunch of it left over from another project, so I decided to use a foot of it. After having used it, I highly suggest that the only hose you buy if you're making hose is the Teflon lined hose, PTFE. This is the 10 AN 6 and the 3 for the brake lines. I made my own brake line hoses, and they're a lot easier to use. More expensive, you're going to spend about twice as much in fittings and hose, but trust me, when you're trying to put these fittings on the end of if you're using the nylon braiding hoses, it's a nightmare. If you use the steel braiding, it's not as bad, but the problem with the steel is that it sucks up the heat. So anything in the engine compartment is going to be really hot. I learned that the hard way by running my cooling hoses through the steel braided stuff, and I think it actually gained heat instead of losing it. So just keep in mind, I like to use the black braiding, and not only does it look better in my mind, but if you touch it when it's hot, you don't get burnt. So my entire engine compartment is going to be the black braided hoses, but it's going to be in the PTFE because it's a lot easier to use. One thing I want to show is working with the Teflon AN lines, how easy it is to change the length if you need to. I need to shorten this 2 inches. This is my fuel return line coming out of the pressure regulator. And one thing I found with these fittings, this is an AN6 fitting, but you get the fancy wrenches that are aluminum that are not going to scratch it. The problem is the other fittings will not work. whether you've got a 6, a 10, whatever, the wrenches won't go over that fitting. So you really need a crescent wrench type setup that you can adjust and make work on it. This is an aluminum wrench. Unfortunately, I've only got one, so I just have to use a standard crescent wrench. If you put tape on, that would help keep it from scratching. If you put some electrical tape on it, right there I just nicked it a little bit. I think it'll be a big deal because you'll never see it. It's under the regulator. But if it's something that was going to be out in the open, I would definitely have put some tape on that. So this is the male fitting. Now I just need to get this fitting off. Actually, what I'm going to do is cut this back. I'm actually going from the end of the line, not the end of the fitting. So 2 inches back. Again, if you're doing this, I highly recommend just using a nylon tie wrap. Works much better than tape. What I've done so far is just cut through the steel braiding. So all that's left is the Teflon line. If you don't get through the steel braiding, you're going to have problems. So at this point, I can continue using the Dremel, go through the Teflon. What I like to use is a serrated knife and cut it that way. Basically sawing through the Teflon. Actually, I had to cut through a piece of steel that I didn't get out. So now I've got to get this nut off of this hose. So once you get the old olive off, that's garbage. What I like about the Evil Energy Teflon lines is they send you extra olives, about a half dozen extras. So if you ever have to redo hoses, it makes your life a lot easier. You don't have to go out and buy them externally. So as you can see, there's just a little bit of debris on the end of this. Cut the tie wrap off. And then put the nut back over the hose. I do have a couple little wires left over. So you want to snip them off. So now we need to put the olive back over the Teflon line, and to do that you've got to pull back the steel braiding so you have just clean Teflon lines. Take the little tool that comes with the hose kit, put it in there to clean up the line, get it straight. Put your olive over the line until it's flush with the face. Take your male fitting. So I should have put the olive. Put that back in just to make sure it's clean. Put that in. Come back over with your nut. So that's it. Line's now 2 inches shorter. Wasn't that hard to do. The only part I had to use was the olive.